one thing that I really got inspired when I read his book was seeing him being active very locally, caring about his neighbors' needs, but also looking into the world, going to the Iraq when there was the war, caring about national themes like the death penalty or other things, and also getting really creative in addressing them. So that's going to be the second part of this evening, talking a little bit more about this aspect. And I give you the word again, Shane.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. And I'm trying to talk slow, and I'm trying to make my Southern accent go away, which is really hard for me. I got a real strong Southern accent, but it's awesome. It's really great to be a part of the conversation. So this second piece, I've got some photos I'm going to show you in just a minute. But I wanted to begin in a scripture that has been very meaningful to me. And it's one of the scriptures that is one of the stories that's often very familiar. In fact, that's one of the challenges. It can be so familiar that it's hard to hear anything new. So I kind of want to invite you to just listen with fresh ears as you hear this story that might be new to some of us, but it might be very familiar to others. It's the story we often call the Good Samaritan. And as the story begins, an expert in the law is coming to test Jesus and says, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" And the man says back, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart. Love your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus says, "You've answered correctly. Do this and you will live." And then it says this, "But the man wanted to justify himself. And he said, 'Who is my neighbor?'" And I want to just pause by saying, anytime someone asks, "Who is my neighbor?" that's a very dangerous question, right? Because they're also asking, who is not my neighbor, right? Like who's exempt from love and compassion and justice? Who can I get away with ignoring, right? And Jesus says this. This is the story that he tells in response. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes. They beat him and went away, leaving him half dead, unconscious. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place, saw him and passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was and saw him and had compassion on him. He went to the man and bandaged up his wounds, pouring on him oil and wine. Then the man put him on his own donkey and took him to an inn and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper and said, "Look after him. And when I return, I'll reimburse you for any extra expense you have." Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? That's Jesus's story. And I just want to offer it as we think about it, to reflect. There's a couple of things worth noting in the story. And one of them is that the religious folks ignore the suffering of the man in the ditch, right? I mean, this is typical Jesus. It's been said Jesus constantly includes the excluded and challenges the chosen. So he's challenging our notions in this story. Like the Levite and the priest were the quintessential religious people. And I sometimes joke that they must have been on their way to a church meeting or a trustee meeting because they were so determined that they did not have time to be interrupted. But the Samaritan, right, is outcast in every way. And it was because Samaritans were an interracial community. So they crossed cultural boundaries, but they also had some different unorthodox ways of thinking about how you worship. So for those 2 reasons, the Samaritans, like a lot of religious folks, didn't even walk through Samaria. They avoided Samaritans at all costs. And yet Jesus makes the Samaritan the hero of the story. He may not have had all of his theology right, but he had his compassion right. He had his love right. And I think that's a part of the story that we pay attention to, is that you can have all the great theology, but in the end, if it doesn't move you to respond to someone who's beat up in a ditch, then what good is our theology? And the other thing worth noting in this story is that it never would have happened if people were not walking down a road where people get beat up. And it occurs to me that a lot of our life is about moving away from the places where people get beat up. And yet this story is reminding us that proximity makes all the difference in the world. Jesus moved into the pain of the world, and the gravity of the gospel takes us towards those who are suffering. The other thing that occurs to me is that interruptions are inconvenient. People get beat up at very inconvenient times. But this story is about an interruption. Half the stories in the gospel are interruptions. Jesus is on his way somewhere and people run out of wine at their wedding, or someone's kid is sick and they're asking him to come to their house and help heal the child. And so it's one interruption after another. And I think this story is a reminder that injustice is worth being interrupted for. That when a crisis is happening, when someone's life is at stake, we change our routines, we ignore our daytimers, and we do what love requires of us. One other thought on the story itself is that scholars point out that we really don't know anything about the person in the ditch. And this may be a part of the point of the story. The two ways that you would typically be able to identify someone have been stripped of them. So the person is stripped naked. Their clothes are not on them. And that would be one way that you could see who they were, or where they were from, or what religion they held. And yet that's a part of the point of this, right? The other one is that they are not unconscious. So we don't know their accent or their language. And all that we know about this person in the ditch is that they are a child of God, made in the image of God. We don't know their religion. We don't know their politics. We don't know their sexual orientation. All that we know is that they are made in the image of God. And so it invites us to kind of think of those who are beaten on life's roadside in the world that we live in right now, and to say, what might this story invite us to do? Dr. Martin Luther King had a really powerful sermon on this story. And one of the things that he says is that there's an element of fear, that the religious folks may be worried about what would happen to them if they stopped, because this is a dangerous road and the robbers might still be around. But the Samaritan is not worried about what will happen to him if he stops. He's worried about what will happen to the man in the ditch if he doesn't stop. And having our eyes on the suffering of another person causes us to not be obsessed with the fear of what might happen to us if we respond. And the other thing that Dr. King says about this story is that after you lift so many people out of the ditch, like we're called to be the Good Samaritan, but after you lift so many people out of the ditch, you start to say, maybe we need to rethink the whole road to Jericho. We need to do something about why people keep ending up in the ditch to begin with. And as we think, during this next few minutes about politics and social justice, I would suggest that most of this begins with compassion, welcoming immigrants, taking care of folks that are hungry. And all of those things are really, really important. And compassion naturally leads us to justice. After you feed a lot of hungry people, you want to do something about why people are hungry to begin with. After you lift so many people off the sidewalk, after they've been shot, you want to do something about why we have so many gun deaths in our country. And you ask, where are the guns coming from, right? And after we look at this story, I think one of the invitations is to say, we're going to reimagine the road to Jericho. We don't just want to be taking care of victims. We want to be doing something about what's creating victims to begin with. And one of my mentors, he said, we've all heard the saying, give a person a fish and they'll eat for a day, teach them to fish and they'll eat for the rest of their life, right? You've heard that saying, you know, and he says, but we've also got to ask, who owns the pond? We've got to do something about access to the pond, or otherwise there are people that may know how to fish and have a fishing rod, but they can't get to the pond. Or what good is it to know how to fish if the pond is polluted and the fish make you sick? Or why does a fishing license cost so much that it's prohibitive, you know, in letting everybody have access to the pond? So the question of who owns the pond is a part of, I think, the calling of the gospel. And, you know, there's a lot of aversion to politics within the church. We don't need to get political, you know, but I want to dig a little bit deeper and say that the word polis and the word politics actually originate from the origin of the word polites in Greek is the citizenry, the people. The word polis means the city, right? So cosmopolitan, or, you know, in the US we've got Minneapolis and Indianapolis. It's these cities that we're trying to think, what does it look like to live together as people? And I would suggest that loving our neighbor as ourself means that we cannot ignore the policies that affect their lives. And that's why, you know, having a conversation around God's global goals and the you know, sustainable development goals, that part of this is holy work of loving our neighbor and making sure that they flourish. And these are not mutually exclusive things that, you know, a lot of times when people talk about guns, they say it's not a gun problem, it's a heart problem. And I always say it can be both. And God heals hearts, but we have the power to change laws. And we should be doing everything that we can to make sure that people flourish. And Dr. King knew this. Martin Luther King, he had a great line where he said, a law cannot make you love me, but it can make it harder for you to kill me. It's a great line, right? A law can't make you love me, but it can make it harder for you to kill me. And so no law can change a racist heart. No law can, you can't legislate love. But we can make it harder for people to kill other folks, and we can make it easier for people to flourish through the policies that we have. So, you know, in the civil rights movement, we needed God to change racist hearts, but we also needed our laws to change so that Black folks and white folks could go to the same schools and swim in the same swimming pools, and that folks could be treated as equal and have all the rights to vote and everything else, right? So laws also needed to change. And, you know, I think about something like cars, automobiles, right? They're not designed to kill, but they can be deadly. And so we've done a whole lot of things to try to protect people from the harm that could be done by irresponsibly using a car. So, you know, you have to get a driver's license, you have to pass a driving test. We have, you know, laws, speed limits, and if you abuse your license, you lose it, right? So there's a lot of things that we do to try to create policies that are meant to protect life. We even have technology, airbags and things like that, you know. So all of those things that are meant to protect life. And I would suggest on, you know, whether it's guns or criminal justice or inequities between the rich and the poor, the environment, all of our policies should be asking the question, what does love require of us? How do we make it harder for people to kill? How do we make it easier for people to flourish? And literally, I think for those of us who are Christians and others, you know, people of conscience, love should be the compelling force behind our policies, that we think about, whether it's immigration or like in our country, I think with the gun violence, it's often fear that is driving our policies instead of love. And there's a scripture about that, right? That perfect love casteth out fear. So that's, what we're kind of claiming is asking the question, what would the United States look like if love was the force, the motivation behind our policies on immigration or on our policies around healthcare, not these fears of scarcity or fears of other people. And I think that this is where the church has a real role to play. You can tell I like Martin Luther King. I take a lot of my wisdom from him. And one of the things that Dr. King said is that the church is not meant to be the master of the state. And the church is not meant to be the servant of the state. The church is meant to be the conscience of the state, the holy conscience, to wake people up with love and compassion. That's what our role is, to call the state to do justice, to advocate for those who are most vulnerable and often forgotten. That's our role as the church. So I wanted to show you just a few pictures here, because I think we can talk, in all kinds of different ways, but sometimes images offer us some kind of stir our imagination. So let me get my screen on here. And this is our front door at the simple way. And I show you this because I think it captures exactly what we're talking about today. Heal all that is broken in our hearts, in our streets, and in our world. Salvation is personal, but God so loves the world, right? God is healing the world. God is inviting us to participate in changing the things that are wrong in the world. So this is our front door. And I wanted to show you a few of the just glimpses of what this justice work, this political imagination has looked like for us. I'm going to start local and kind of zoom out a little bit, but 10 years ago, we had a really terrible fire. And it started in one of the abandoned factories in our neighborhood. It burnt our whole block down. It burnt our community center. It burnt my home down. And 100 families were affected by this fire. It was one of the biggest fires in our neighborhood's history. And thankfully, no one was hurt. But the response of our city was terrible. They fined all of us who had our house burned down. And just in case you missed that, it was a city-owned abandoned factory where the fire started, and it had been set on fire multiple times. And that fire spread across the street and burned our house down. And we were faced with $10,000 fines from the city that said this is a health hazard, and you have to clean it up. And we're living in trash bags because our house burnt down. But you can see how someone could become homeless. My neighbor literally went to try to go get a new house after her house burnt down. And they said her credit had been destroyed and they couldn't loan her money for a house because she owed $10,000 on the house. And so someone can become homeless because of nothing that they did wrong, right? So we had to mobilize our whole neighborhood and we began to reclaim this space. So this is what it looked like 10 years ago. And then this is what we've built now. We've created a garden and we've reclaimed that space. And we've been advocating our city to give us the land back where the factory burnt down. And the way that we did that was by bringing attention to the negligence of the city. And we asked the city to donate that land. You can see this mural on the wall. And then they didn't do that. And so we just kept pressuring them and building momentum. And you can see that the 5 there turned to a 6 in this sign, and we kept changing it 7, 8 every year. And finally, after almost 10 years of rallying, we were able to get that land back. And now we're collaborating with other groups to build a community center there. But it took the whole neighborhood coming together and mobilizing to build that, what we call Phoenix Park, because it came out of the ashes. And then, this is one of the most local forms of organizing work that we've had to do. And now we've painted murals. This is a nice one. This is a little Banksy counterfeit on one of our walls. But one of the other things that we deal with is, so we're trying to make beauty, we're trying to make art, but we're also plagued by drug addiction. And we have needles that the young people keep finding everywhere. So what we did was we had a campaign called Need a Little Help. And we put these needles in jars, and I've got one of them right here actually. And we delivered them to our city officials as a plea for help, that we've lost 1,200 lives to drug addiction, and our kids have needles that they find on the sidewalk, and it's not okay. And so we delivered these jars of needles to our mayor, to our health commissioners, and to the city council folks. And we had a press conference. And the whole point of this was to make it uncomfortable, to make the urgency of this public health crisis so uncomfortable that people have to respond. And so that's one form of what I think creative protest can look like, right? To be the conscience of our government. That's one expression of it. And just a couple more there's a lot of folks that have really spoken ill of refugees and immigrants. And so what we've done is try to create a campaign that's doing a different messaging, right? Making it normal, normalizing, welcoming refugees and immigrants. This is a church in Chicago where it says, of course, we welcome refugees, we're Christians. And I like the, this is, it's kind of a no-brainer. I like the way that they're very straightforward about it. But we've really had to push our governments to be more open to welcoming people. And one of the ways that we did that was we had pastors all over the country gather up the prayers and the dreams of immigrant families. And we brought those to the halls of Congress. And this is a group of us that are there praying outside the walls of our Congress people. And we're reading those prayers of immigrant families that are really longing to have citizenship in our country. And we read those until we were arrested. And we were arrested for not leaving when we were asked to. And one of the police officers arresting us whispered in my ear and said, "We're with you. Many of us believe the same as you do, that we need to do better at showing love to immigrants and refugees." I did ask him then, "Why are you arresting us?" But anyway, it was a really powerful thing. And it's also why, we have a history of nonviolent direct action. So, Martin Luther King and John Lewis and others in our country said, this is why we can smile in our mugshots when we go to jail, because we know that we're on the right side of history. And this is what I think, we have a whole tradition of civil disobedience in the church. Another one that we've been addressing in our country, I know many of you don't have the death penalty in your country. In fact, the US is one of the only countries still executing people. We're usually in the top 5 executing countries in the world, and we're always in the top 10. The other countries that execute are China, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and the US is right in that mix. And so we have been doing vigils in states where executions happen, but also in our capital in Washington, D.C. So this is a group of us that gather and we hold roses in 2 different colors. One for the victims of violence, because we want to make it very clear that to be against the death penalty is not to be numb to the pain of those who have been victims of murder. In fact, we have many murder victims' family members who are with us. So we hold a rose for the victims of violence, and we also hold a rose for the victims of execution. And we held all of their names on signs. So there's 1,500 names of people that our country has executed over the past 40 years or so. And then we held a banner on the steps of the Supreme Court. And that is illegal in our country. The irony is that the Supreme Court that defends the right to free speech does not allow free speech on its property. And so just holding a banner is illegal. So we were able to bear witness. We went to jail for this action, but then in court, we put the death penalty on trial. And we said, isn't it ironic that we were arrested for holding a banner that said essentially stop killing? And yet it is legal in our country to still execute people. And we said, you know, our country's on the wrong side of history. So this is one of those witnesses that we have. And the last one that I'll share with you before we open it up is around gun violence. And this is one of the actions that we had around the gun violence in our neighborhoods. We've had churches that put out memorials with the names. It's a little hard to see the shirts, but the names and ages of those who have died in our streets are on these shirts, and they're placed as a memorial. And I share this image because it's very powerful to think about going into worship, going to church worship, and seeing all of the names to remind us that this work is unfinished, right? And as we go into worship, we're going out with a mission of transforming the world, because God's kingdom on earth does not look like this. It doesn't look like people dying every day of gun violence in our country. And of course, our work on the guns to plows is, you know, we've been chopping up guns, donated guns all over our country. And these are a few images of that. An AR-15 that we've chopped up and then that we began to transform into garden tools. And to me, this is part of what I think we've got to do is find ways of protesting, or as I say, protestifying, you know, of proclaiming that not only are things wrong, but they can be different. So, you know, to protestify is to say things can be different. And every time we turn a gun into a garden tool, that's what we're really claiming. So this is an AK-47. It's actually the first gun that we ever had donated. And that's what we made out of it. So that's the before and that's the after. And then we've been doing it for 10 years all over the country. And it's very holy work. You know, it's a way that we're honoring the grief and trauma that people have experienced and channeling that into change. And we also talk about how, you know, it is about transforming a gun, but we also need to be transforming, you know, our streets and policies so that they do a better job at protecting life. So, yeah, those are some of the shovels that we made, and hearts. That's a pretty cool one, little tractor. I actually thought of the tractors in Ukraine that were pulling the tanks, you know, as I saw that one. These are other pieces of art that are made out of guns. That's in Iraq. Our friends in Najaf poured guns into the streets and ran over them and let the kids drive to crush the guns. That's in Mozambique. A assault rifle turned into a saxophone. This was in honor of the Jewish lives that were lost in an act of hatred. It's a menorah, of course, made out of transformed guns. Those are shovels made by Pedro Reyes in Mexico. He's also made a whole orchestra out of guns. So I share, you know, all of these with you just as we open up the conversation to say that as we think of policies and as we think of protest, it's really about imagination, right? It's about the ability to think things can be different. And that's exactly what our faith is about. You know, the scriptures say that faith is the substance of things hoped for, but not yet seen. And so as people of faith, we should be the most defiant ones, that violence doesn't have to be normal, that poverty doesn't have to be normal. And when Dr. King was once accused of being maladjusted, this is what he said in response: maybe I am maladjusted, because we have a world that has become way too adjusted to racism. We live in a world that has become way too adjusted to violence, way too adjusted to inequity. And we need to be wholly maladjusted people in that world. So thanks for letting me share, and thanks for taking a look at these images. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks again, Shane. I think in the end, you gave us a good task to find ways of protesting. And we already heard it on Saturday at our day conference that we sometimes need to get a little bit uncomfortable to others to make a change. And I think with this topic, even more than the other one before, we have to make some translations to our context, since gun violence and the death penalty are maybe not the most important topics here in Switzerland. But what are the topics that we as Christians should be concerned about? As you said, we cannot ignore the policies that affect our neighbors. So which policies do we have in Switzerland which do affect our neighbors, and we should care about and stand up against and find creative ways maybe of protesting? Two questions concerning climate crisis and climate action. What should we do, especially as Christians, against the climate crisis? And would you see civil disobedience as a good way of protesting for a Christian against climate change and make the urgency known to the government? And I know, Shane, that's a topic that you do care as well. So I'm happy to hear from you what's your ideas on that topic.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of different ways that we need to think about the climate crisis. And one of them is our own responsibility to live well in the earth. And so, and then our challenge to the things that are destroying the earth outside of our own lifestyle, right? You know, companies and others that are exploiting the earth. So, you know, we've tried to, I travel a lot. And so I try to have all the groups that I fly out to speak to offset the carbon footprint of my travels so that I'm a certified green preacher. I at least try to do that, you know. We also have a responsibility to try to live well in the land that we have. So we try to raise a lot of our own food. For a long time, we were running cars off of waste vegetable oil, making biodiesel out of, you know, restaurant oil that's thrown out. Right now, my wife and I live in a tiny house, a bus part of the time that is, it's an old school bus that has a composting toilet and solar panels. And so we're trying to leave very little footprint. And we've gone solar, you know, in our buildings in Philadelphia. So I think there's, you know, that let's get the log out of our own eye thing. But then we also, I think I've got to find ways, as one of the questions suggested, at stressing the urgency of what's at stake, you know. And so, like Dr. King said, red lights, traffic lights are a good thing. But when there's a fire, the fire trucks and ambulances, you know, they run through the red lights, and there is a fire happening right now. And so we don't just sort of go on with business as usual. One of the questions I think is between what is effective and what is faithful. And so I think civil disobedience can be both. It can be a very faithful, nonviolent way of turning up the volume on the urgency. But we're also trying to persuade new people to care about it. And there are ways of protesting that I think can shut people down or turn people off. And there are ways of protesting that I think can open people up. So that's some of that's a strategic question, is the best way that we can make the point by blocking an intersection? Or are there other ways, or even strategically, where we do civil disobedience matters, I think that's some of the questions that we're always asking is, what's the point that we're making? And are we opening up conversation? Are we winning new folks over? And, but I think without a doubt, civil disobedience is a rich tradition for Christians and many others. And there's other ways of divesting too, right? Where, when being about the abolition of slavery meant not putting sugar in your tea or your coffee, that divesting or boycotting is another way of leveraging that. And I think there's all kinds of ways that we can do resistance and civil disobedience in ways that do move the barometer towards caring about these things. So thanks for the question.
Thanks for the answer. I have another one for you, which might be a little bit hard for you to answer since the Swiss political structure is quite different from yours in the US, but I give it to you and you do your best. Is it wise to go into party politics as Christians to change structures?
Well, so I think some of this is a calling, right? Of like all of us are doing we have different vocations, we have different ways that we're trying to bring about change. What I would say is that if you go into politics, then we're meant to be that prophetic witness, like Daniel in the king's court. But he doesn't drink the king's Kool-Aid. He fasts from the king's food and keeps his own integrity and his own credibility. The challenge in the U.S. is that even as I think love requires that we care about policies, that doesn't mean that we're partisan, that we believe that all of our hope, especially in the US, we've got two parties, and it's hard to find a party that is consistently advocating for life, that is consistently caring about the poor, and those things. So I don't believe in just putting all of our chips in with a party. That's why we wrote a book called Jesus for President that is about the fact that our hope is in Jesus. Jesus's teaching is our framework for why we care about these political issues, and love is the compelling force behind them. So I think that's one of the radical things about the early Christians is they didn't have their hope entirely invested in the political systems of their time. Their hope was in Jesus. But then we also want to work with anyone that is going to try to help us move closer to the goals of Jesus. So when you think about the sustainable development goals, I like, the God's global goals, many of those are lining up with things that are at the heart of Jesus. So we want to work together with everyone that we can to accomplish those things like caring for the earth, the inequities between the super rich and the poor, making sure that everyone has adequate health care and good education. All of those things, those should be no brainers. So the question is kind of, how do we best get towards that end? But let's at least agree that things like healthcare and education and caring for the earth, like these are not just partisan issues. These are gospel issues. These are at the heart of our faith. I think one of the challenges is that obviously the issues are different, in your context and ours, but I think some of the themes of how we stir people's imaginations are similar, and even the proximity, right? Being near to the people who are affected. So you've got jails, maybe not as many as we do, but, how can we do a better job at helping folks who are incarcerated or coming out, welcoming immigrants? I think some of those things are really consistent, hopefully. And, Yeah, I see the question about how to deal with U.S. friends and evangelicals who support Trump and the death penalty and things like that. So, I mean, part of why I've written a book on the death penalty and guns in particular is that Christians are the biggest support base for those two things. We're the biggest owners of guns. We're the biggest supporters of the death penalty. And that's very, very troubling to me. And I find it really helpful to keep centered around Jesus as we talk about those things. I mean, obviously, that's where we get our name, Red Letter Christians. Gandhi said that when he was asked about Christianity, I love Jesus. I just wish the Christians acted more like him. And that's what we keep coming back to. I think the best corrective to what's gone wrong in American Christianity is Jesus. And there's a lot of Christians that have taken their eyes off of Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes. And when we do that, we end up, focusing on things Jesus didn't talk about and not focusing on the things that Jesus talked a whole lot about. So there's so much damage that's being done by the Trump evangelicalism and folks like Franklin Graham and others that it's hard to see that. There's a lot of people that are leaving a version of Christianity that is really abandoned Jesus and is more in love with Trump than Jesus, and is really, I think, lost its grounding. And so I tell people, when you reject Trump evangelicalism, that may not be the end of your spiritual journey. That may be the beginning of it. So deconstructing and shutting the door of a toxic version of Christianity really might be the opening of something new. And the landscape of what God is doing is so much bigger than that white evangelicalism. So we are working hard to change the narrative of what Christians care about. And the way that we do that is by amplifying the many voices of Christians who are centered around Jesus and care about justice and immigration and life and the environment and all of those things. So it's a challenge. Keep us in your prayers over here.
Right. When we met before, you said you've been to Switzerland before. So I have a question that you might be able to answer. If you think about Swiss Christians, what images and thoughts come to your mind?
The blissful heaven on earth. I mean, I see all these images, on Instagram and stuff, and they're always Switzerland, but I know better, I know that's part of it, but I also know that I think one of the challenges of I see in Europe and from my very small experience in Switzerland is that when you have decent social infrastructures, you begin to say, like, what is there left for the church to do? I mean, it's one thing to be here in America where we've got so much chaos. But I think that's where you can have healthcare, but not have someone holding your hand in the hospital. You can have housing, but people still be very alone. And so I think there's still a calling to community and to love, and we can still live very isolated lives. So that call to community and to solidarity with the folks that are marginalized is always before us. So, but I love what I've experienced in Switzerland. I hope to get back over there soon, man.
Good. We're glad to have you here.
Meanwhile, I'll still be watching those videos on Instagram, and my wife and I, we always go, "Ooh, Switzerland." Yeah.
Is that also something that you try to stand up against at some point, Shane? I think there's strong lobbies for guns or gasoline in the US.
Oh yeah, massive, absolutely massive. Yeah. So one of the quotes from Henry Ford, you know, the Ford manufacturing, like one of the things he said is, if you want to know how to stop violence, just see who's profiting from it. And that's certainly true on nearly everything, you know, so many of these things. Somebody asked what we're working on now. And I mean, we are still doing the guns and the plows. We're working on several major execution cases. One of them is a woman in Texas, Melissa Lucio, who is wrongfully convicted. Her child died tragically, and she was convicted of the murder and is facing execution for the murder of her child that she was wrongfully convicted of. So you can keep her and her family in your prayers. We'll be doing a lot around that. I'm just finishing a book that is connecting the dots of a lot of these issues around a more comprehensive ethic of life. So what does it mean to champion life without exceptions, and to connect, you know, all of these different issues, to say every person is made in the image of God, and not just pro-life on one issue, but to be, you know, really consistent with that ethic of life. So that book will come out, you know, next year. Yeah, and then someone else mentioned the sexuality of, you know, LGBTQ plus folks. It's certainly something that's splitting many denominations in the U.S. The Methodists, many Anabaptist churches are splitting. And I've become convinced that we're probably not all going to agree on the sacrament of marriage or same-sex marriage, but that we should find some common ground in advocating the dignity of every person, championing the rights of sexual minorities, LGBTQ folks, and not just talking about it as an issue, but so many of these things are about people that are made in the image of God, that we are called to love. And actually, Billy Graham, when he was asked about sexuality, he said, it's God's job to judge, it's the Spirit's job to convict, and it's our job to love. And that's a pretty good line. You know, I think that we get kind of out of whack when we're the ones that are judging and convicting rather than loving. And much more to be said on that. But there was a study done in the US that said, that asked young non-Christians, what are your perceptions of Christians? And the number one answer was anti-gay, anti-homosexual. And regardless of, you know, where you fit, how you feel about it, like when that's the number one thing that we're known for, like surely that's a problem, you know. I mean, that we become known more for who we've excluded than who we've embraced, and more for what we're against than what we're for. And we become known, you know, in yeah. Anyway, I'll stop there, but yeah. Well, thanks for your important work, first of all. And I don't know that there's a magic solution to that, but I mean, a couple of things that you probably already do and thought of, but I found them effective for us is one of them is realizing that that God loves the world that God made, and over is calling it good, and that the story ends with the in Revelation with the restoration of creation, right? So the New Jerusalem has the river of life and the tree of life, and it's the kind of image of a city flourishing with creation and life, and that makes a really big difference, that how you think this story ends. And so I think we've got some work to do to disentangle ourselves from the bad theology. There's a book, Stephen Bowman Prediger wrote a book called For the Beauty of the Earth, beautiful book. But he also talks about the images in scripture that the world is consumed by fire. And he says, if you believe that fire is burning up the world and that this world is just going to hell, then it really affects the way that you live. You know, I mean, we literally had one pastor that said, this world is not my home. That's why I can drive an SUV, because I just see it as bringing Jesus back sooner. So that's some real messed up theology, right? But the answer to bad theology isn't no theology. It's doing better theology, like, so, like what Stephen does in that book is talk about the fire as a refining fire, just like something is pruned. The whole purpose is to bring things back to life and not to destroy things, but to refine them. And, there's a lot of ways that I think we can do better theology that leads to creation care, that leads to protecting species that are disappearing. And one other thing that we can do is not separate the human condition from the climate crisis, because those who are going to suffer most deeply are also vulnerable populations, of people. And so it is a part of loving our neighbor is caring about the climate crisis. But you can also care about the climate crisis because that matters to God too. The people matter and the earth matters. So keep it up. Yeah, it's important work. There's a question in the chat here about topics like abortion, and there's very little in the scripture that speaks to abortion. I mean, there's some poetic words, that were knitted in the womb. But I'm doing a lot of work on this right now, trying to show how abortion became the eclipsing issue that makes all others sort of less relevant, that to be pro-life for many people is just to be pro-birth, right? Or to be anti-abortion. And once you're born, that we're often not as pro-life as we were before the baby was born. And I really like the early church because of how consistent their ethic of life was. And they do talk about abortion, the early Christians do. But they also talk about the violence of war and militarism. They talk about the death penalty. They talk about the gladiatorial games, which they saw as a real glamour, a way of glamorizing violence. And so they were consistently a voice for life and against death in every form and manifestation it had in its culture. And so I've got, the book that I'm writing, I really look at the writings of the early Christians and what it means to be a champion of life on not just one issue, but all of them. So more to be said on that, but that seems like we are masters in emphasizing, like focusing on things that are not central issues. They still can matter, but the ethic of life, I think, is a big one that that should be the center of our attention. That God made every person in the image of God. We're going to protect that, and we haven't done that very well especially in our country. I mean, we've got a lot of Christians that are very loud on abortion and yet are the biggest champions of the death penalty and war and anti-environment and everything else. So we got to do better. Yeah.
Yeah, that surely is a hot topic also here in Switzerland.
Yeah, the question that we're asking is how can we reduce the number of abortions? And one of the most effective ways to do that is to provide better assistance to young and families that are facing the possibility of abortion. The number one reason listed in the United States is financial stability. So childcare, medical care, all those things, if people really care about reducing abortion, that's one of the best things that we can be doing, and accompanying folks in those situations, right? So where we're not just having bumper stickers and t-shirts, but we're walking alongside of people that are in tough situations, because feeling alone in those situations is part of the crisis.
Yeah, we have sisters and brothers all over the world caring about this topic, about God's global goals. We're not alone, and together we can make a change. We have also one question which is left in the Q&A that says it's easy to build a wheelchair ramp, but how can we address structural change or structural injustice? And that surely will be a topic on Tuesday nights when we have the evening with the Christian Public Affairs, who really tries to bring out of a Christian perspective the topics into the Swiss parliament, into the Swiss politics system. So we hear from there another workshop, and yeah, I hope you got inspired as Matthias did 12 or 13 years ago from Shane Claiborne. It was nice to have you. Also for me, it was a very pleasure to hear you talking, and yeah, some challenging thoughts that we need to give room in our lives and think about it more. How can we take actions? We have now some ideas collected that are topics here in Switzerland, like speak out against exporting weapons, take responsibility in the financial sector, to care about our Rohstoffhandel, the Konzernverantwortungsinitiative, or just giving 1.7% of our GDP to sustainable development work. So yeah, there is topics that we can address here in Switzerland, and I hope you got inspired to get active.
But I will give us a little send out. How about that? This is from, we did a common prayer, which we, actually we do prayer on the 1st of each month. So we're getting ready to do it on Friday, on April 1st. And we have folks join from around the world. I'd love to have you join us. I think it's actually not a terrible time for you. It might be in the middle of work or something, but we do it at 9 a.m. Eastern time, which should probably be in the afternoon, your time. But I'll send us out with one of the prayers that we have. I love this kind of benediction. Yeah, so let's stay in touch, and you can keep following. I'm on social media. I'm pretty active. It's just my name. I'll put it in the chat there. And then Red Letter Christians is our kind of global network of, we always say we're aspiring to live as if Jesus meant the stuff he said. So it's redletterchristians.com there. And this is our little benediction. So may God bless you with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you may live deep within your heart. And may God bless you with anger, holy anger, at injustice, oppression, and the exploitation of people, so that you may long for freedom, justice, and peace. And may God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in the world, so that you can do what others claim cannot be done. Amen.
Amen.
Go in peace.